All right. Hello, everybody. Hope you all are doing well. This is DFS Army's tournament strategy show where we're going to look at last night's slate. We're going to game plan today's slate and just get to it. A little early today. Hopefully, it doesn't mess up things for too many people, but got to do what you got to do. Let's go ahead and look at last night. So, this is the $100,000 winning lineup from last night. This was super optimal. Upsilon B, or however you say it, won by a decent amount. This was the second place winning lineup. He had 372. First place was 386. So very optimal line. For me last night was pretty positive, but pretty meh too. Nothing to jump up and down about. But hey, positive night's a positive night. Dennis Schroeder was someone, and Bruce Brown, same situation. We knew it was a good game environment, but ultimately I didn't force exposure to either one of these guys. I had some exposure naturally, but not enough to really matter. But both of those guys really came through, Bruce Brown in particular. Aaron Nesmith was the surprise of the slate. These Pacer guys are pretty tough to predict, especially when Nesmith, especially with Halliburton coming back last night as well. Wasn't on Nesmith, wouldn't have gone back and changed anything either here, but he had a great night. Josh Hart was a core play, so that went well. Clint Capella, we talked about. We knew he was cheap. We knew he had a good matchup. Just never overly excited about his overall upside. Even here, it was really his price tag that made things work. He didn't really have a remarkable performance or anything like that, but he still made it in there, so that's awesome for him. Dante DiVincenzo, we were on. He was a core play. Kuminga, I didn't get to. I hate the Warriors in general, and so a lot of these guys on this team went off last night. Kuminga did well. Curry did well. Andrew Wiggins did well. There were a decent amount of people who were playing Kuminga. We had exposure, but I wasn't anywhere close to field weight, so that hurt a little bit. But I did play Tobias Harris, who's about 1K more expensive, who had a similar point performance. So that helped me stay afloat, even though I was under on Kuminga. And then Curry had a super strong performance, and so he made the nuts. This line, the one that got second place, I still wanted to show just because I think this was a little bit closer to what most of us were hitting on. And so you were still able to have a strong performance without playing Curry and a lot of the Warriors. Anyway, let's get to today's slate. Thomas Dye, good to see you, man. Capella did make it. He made it in there. Let's look at today's slate. We have a nice 9-game slate. Nothing too crazy. We do have some interesting injury news that is keeping this slate fun and versatile, which I always look for. But let's start off with the first game. We have the Clippers going up against the Wizards. Starting off, this game has the highest total on the slate, 236.5. That already means I'm looking at forcing exposure to this game. The spread is wide, though. Clippers should blow out the Wizards here. So that is obviously a concern. The studs for the Clippers aren't very expensive. 85, 8,200 on Leonard, 8,500 on Harden. A little bit more pricey than they have been here recently, but still not a bad price tag for them by any means, especially in a really good matchup against the Wizards. So for me, I'm prioritizing James Harden. I'm prioritizing Kawhi Leonard. Paul George is viable, especially if he's lower owned than the other two, which I'm expecting him to be. Then Paul George is someone that I'm really looking at as a potential play, a potential guy I'm open to forcing exposure to, but as of right now, he's going to have to be super low owned, probably 8% or less for me to be excited about it. What's up, B-Mac? Nice, 330. Scores were pretty high last night, so I'm not sure where 330 landed you in your tournaments, but hopefully that was pretty solid. Outside of that, we have seen Russell Westbrook have some stronger performances here recently, but I'm not trying to chase it. Same story with Plumlee. He's been in pretty good form here lately, too. I'm a little bit more open to him over Westbrook, but ultimately the exposure I get to these guys is going to be domination station led. I'm only focusing on forcing exposure to Harden and Leonard here as of right now. The Wizards, I'm not as interested in tonight. I always talk about it. I like forcing exposure to games that have high totals, but The reason why this game has a high total is because the Wizards are bad. And so that's a plus matchup for the Clippers, not as much a plus matchup for the Wizards. You can take a shot on Tyus or Gafford if you would like to, or Kuzma, but ultimately I'm not taking a shot here on any of them unless something changes dramatically. All right, we have the Bulls going up against the Hornets. For the Bulls tonight, when it comes to injury news, let's see what we're working with here. We have Terry uncertain to play. Patrick Williams is out. Zach LaVine has been out for a while. So no crazy news here that's shifting things. The reason why the Bulls are going to get ownership today isn't because of a great game environment. These two teams play at a pretty slow pace, and so that is a little worrisome for me. And the total is the lowest total on the slate because of that pace concern. Spread is 4.5 points, which is nice. But the biggest thing here is that the Hornets just suck at defense. And so the cheap price tag on the Bulls, too, also makes them pretty enticing. The main guy I'm looking at here, once again, is Nikola Vucevic. He did disappoint last night, painfully. But the Hornets are still giving up the third most fantasy points in the league against bigs. And so I am going to continue to attack them. And Vucevic is the guy for me today at a pretty solid price tag. This is the back end of a back-to-back for them. A little concerning, but I'm not going to overthink it. I'm playing Vucevic tonight. Ayo had a strong game yesterday as well. Just like yesterday, I'm okay being over the field on him. Not someone I'm looking at as a core play, though. And then Kobe White and DeRozan, ideally they'll show up a good bit naturally, but I'm not trying to go out of my way to force exposure to them. Great matchup for them both, but slow paces in general does give me some concern where I'm not as excited as I typically would be. Any interest in Jordan if Jokic misses for value at center? For sure, he would be viable. But that's more of a wait and see approach for me. I'm not going to get too excited about news that would spice the slate up a little bit. And then vice versa, this Bulls team has not been a great defense, but they've been playing at a slow pace. So this is not a bad matchup for the vast majority of the Hornets. It looks like LaMelo Ball is doubtful, so we're not expecting him to play. We saw the benefit that gave a lot of the Hornets last time out, and they really haven't seen any crazy increases in price. So they're all still very viable for me tonight. In particular, though, let's look at some of my favorite Hornets. This is a great matchup for Brandon Miller. Great matchup for Miles Bridges. Great matchup for PJ Washington. All three of these guys are guys I'm looking at. I want to at least have some exposure to. Miles Bridges, I'm not going to, at least if the slate was locking right now, I wouldn't force a ton of exposure to him. Just because at 8,200, I feel like he's priced appropriately, where we get a bit of a discount on guys like Miller and PJ at 6,600 and 5,800. And then, of course, we have to mention Cody Martin and Nick Richards. They're both playing a lot, and they've been very involved offensively with Rozier and LaMelo out. So I like the Hornets tonight, again, just because of the low game total, slow pace. This game could get ugly, so I'm not trying to go crazy here when it comes to exposure. But this is still a game, and in teams I plan on having a decent amount of tonight. All right, next up we have the Detroit Pistons going up against the Cavaliers. For Detroit, Cade Cunningham is probable. Isaiah Stewart is out. Not a lot changing here for me. Assuming Cade Cunningham plays, I'm not planning on forcing exposure to any of the Pistons tonight. Cavs are a really good defensive team, and the spread is also pretty wide. So similar story for the Wizards. Game environment is solid, but the Pistons are getting the butt end of the stick here. Now, the Cavaliers are where things get interesting. So first things first, we'll look at the injury news. Darius Garland is expected to play. He's been out for what feels like an eternity with his jaw injury. Jared Allen is questionable. That's a new injury. He's fighting an illness or something like that. So if Darius Garland returns, we have to assume he would be on some sort of minutes limit. That does impact Donovan Mitchell. It does impact him from a usage rate, and it does make me a little bit less excited about Donovan Mitchell, but the matchup is so good for Mitchell against this really bad Pistons team where I'm still willing to get a little bit of leverage depending on where his ownership ends up falling. Jared Allen, he's priced well. I like playing bigs against the Pistons. If he doesn't play, then I get way more excited about Evan Mobley, who played last time, had a minutes limit, didn't see his usual run. I would expect him to not be a viable play for me at all if Jared Allen plays. So if Jared Allen's healthy, I'm playing Jared Allen. If Jared Allen's out, I'm forcing a lot more exposure to Evan Mobley. Pistons are awful, and both of these guys are pretty solid bigs, especially when one or the other are out. Then Max Strus is fine at 5,400, but I doubt I'll be getting there too much today. And I'm not playing Darius Garland tonight. All right, next up we have the Kings against the Miami Heat. For the Kings, pretty healthy. Going up against the Heat, not a situation that's standing out too much for me. Of course, you can take your shot on Sabonis here. He's always viable. He's been in decent form as of late, so I'm not overly concerned about that. Matchup is pretty solid for De'Aaron Fox. Heat have struggled against guards, and then Terry Rozier is not helping that issue at all for them. So, I'll be okay with taking a shot on Fox just because of the pretty soft matchup, but ultimately, I'm not excited about any of these guys, and so I'm not planning on forcing exposure unless something happens from like an injury news standpoint for the Heat or the Kings. For the Heat, Duncan Robinson is out, but this team is pretty healthy at this point. They've been struggling from an offensive perspective. I think usage rates are still balancing out. No one's really has been in fantastic form. Seems like this team has gotten worse with Terry, which is a little weird. Thomas, we don't have any definitive news on that minutes limit, but I would assume, yeah, he's still on a minutes limit. But I don't really care what the coach says. I would assume if Jared Allen's out, Mobley probably sees close to what he normally plays. But if Jared Allen plays, I do expect Mobley to still be on some sort of minutes limit. Can't trust these coaches these days, man. Can't trust them. But in general, Bam and Hero are the two that are the most viable for the Heat. But again, I'm not taking a shot here today. So this game's basically a full fade for me at this point just because no one's standing out. I'm fine with like one-off shots here and there. We know on both sides of the ball, there's some streaky shooters there, but just so far in my research, no one's has standed out too much. Next up, we have another boring team, at least for me. We have the Orlando Magic. For the Magic, they're another team that's pretty healthy. Let me double check, make sure we're not missing anything here. Where are the Magic? Magic, yeah, pretty healthy. Gary Harris has been out for a good chunk of time here. You can always take a shot on Paolo, especially against the Spurs, who have been struggling against bigs. Wendell Carter Jr. would be interesting if he was a little bit cheaper, but ultimately there's bigs I like a bit more on this slate. But if he shows up a little bit, I'm fine with it. Suggs has slate breaking upside, but ultimately I don't expect to have too much exposure here. I thought about taking a shot on Paolo, but the sim didn't like him too much. And again, like the matchup's fine. We know we can pick on the Spurs, but the Spurs have really been struggling against guards here recently, and I'm not overly excited about Fultz. So again, just other games I like a bit more on this slate. For the Spurs, the only guy who is even semi-interesting on this team is Victor Wembanyama, per usual. And I think Victor's very viable here once again at 9,200. He's really been pretty consistent at scoring close to 50 points every game. In that last game against Washington, we finally saw him play 30 minutes. He did fine. Ultimately, this is just a fine spot for him. So I don't expect him to be super popular. So if I'm struggling to find leverage plays, Victor's someone I'm considering. as a potential leverage play, but again, nothing standing out too much for him right now. For the Spurs, we do have Keldon Johnson and Zach Collins listed as questionable, so those two pieces matter. Keldon Johnson plays around 20, 25 minutes these days. Zach Collins plays less than 20 minutes most of the time. So, again, just not a team or game environment I'm overly excited about as of right now. All right. Next up, we have the Nuggets against the Thunder. For the Nuggets, when it comes to injury news, Nikola Jokic is questionable. This is obviously a really big deal for this team because Nikola Jokic does so much for them. If Jokic is out, this slate gets turned over on its head and it becomes an entirely different slate. Basically, we would play DeAndre Jordan. We've seen what he can do. Similar story to when Vucevic is out for the Bulls. The backup centers for these teams do a lot when the starting center's out. So DeAndre Jordan would see a nice boost for me. Jamal Murray would become core play worthy. And then Michael Porter Jr. and Aaron Gordon would both see a boost for me as well. You can even consider KCP a little bit more, but he would be not a top priority for me. So Nuggets are a team to watch out for today and a team that I'm hoping we get the news super early for because it opens up a lot and changes a lot. So fingers crossed on that one. For the Thunder, we have injury news once again. SGA is listed as questionable. Chet is questionable. Lou Dort is questionable. So quite a few pieces that will impact a lot here. We know how much SGA does for this team. We know Chet plays a shit ton for this team, and Lou Dort plays a lot of minutes too. So in general, there's honestly just a little bit too much to cover when it comes to possibilities, but we've seen Jalen Williams, Jaylin, see starting minutes before when Chet's been out. We've also seen Aaron Wiggins, Kenrich Williams see boosts too here. So we already have a team like the Mavs that we know we're playing a lot of, but it's very possible we have other value opportunities as well if Jokic is out and if we get some injury news from this Thunder team. So, like I'm saying, this is another team that we're really just going to have to wait and see what that starting lineup looks like, see what usage rates change based off of whoever ends up getting ruled out, because it's really going to shape what we do tonight. So I feel like I'm really just passing the puck, but this game has a gigantic question mark around it, just depending on what happens injury-wise. I hinted towards it already a little bit, but basically for the Mavericks, we have Luka Doncic out, Kyrie Irving is out, Derek Lively is out. Obviously, Luka and Irving being out are huge deals. Dante Exum is also doubtful, and Derek Jones Jr. is doubtful. So they're missing a crap ton of guys. The biggest concern for everyone here is that we've been here before, and sometimes the Mavs have let us down in situations like this, where we have some pretty obvious value. We know these guys are going to see minutes, but sometimes they suck. We know the Timberwolves have been one of the best defenses in the NBA this season, but there are some weak points here. The Timberwolves are giving up the 8th most points in the league to shooting wings. That is what Tim Hardaway Jr. is considered. And so the matchup for Tim Hardaway isn't as difficult as you might assume without looking too closely at the matchup. So Tim Hardaway Jr. is someone that I have absolutely no concerns playing tonight. He'll be in the vast majority of my lineups at 6K. Next up, you'll see a lot of Jaden Hardy. We know what Hardy can do, especially when he sees consistent minutes. I'm fine with it. The matchup is tough. Conley and crew, they've been the best at stopping Guards like Hardy, and it's a tough matchup, but at 4,400, I'm not going to question it. I'm just going to eat the chalk there. Grant Williams is another guy who's projecting pretty well at 4K. A little bit more nervous about Grant. We've seen him have some high upside performances. Typically in those games, Kleba has been out. So there's a little bit of overlap there. Kleba's playing tonight, but they're still missing quite a few bigs. Lively being out does secure his role for me as well. So I'm fine eating the Grant Williams chalk, but that does make me a little bit more nervous. Josh Green should show up a good bit for us. He's one of those low usage, high minutes guys. So not someone I want to have as a core play, but I'm okay having leverage on. And then Kleba showing up a little bit too at 3,500. Another guy I'm okay being over the field on, but not a situation I want to go crazy with here. We know Kleba can be pretty hit or miss. Not the highest usage guy there either. So overall, I'm playing the Mavs. I'm okay with them showing up. Only guy I'm really going to force in, even though he's going to show up naturally too, is Tim Hardaway Jr. But this is a team I like a lot today. If we get other value from the Nuggets and Thunder, I will prioritize outside of Tim Hardaway Jr. Some of those pieces in the Thunder and Nuggets, if it makes sense to do so, though. Timberwolves are looking cheap or looking like they're all looking like solid plays today because they get the matchup against don't even want to call them an NBA team at this point, but basically the G League version of the Mavericks. And it's hard to make an argument against them because they're not very expensive. Michael Ortiz, good morning, man. Hope you're doing all right. The only concern for me about the Timberwolves is just that they're healthy. Mike Conley is questionable. That would open things up a little bit. We know Nickeil Alexander-Walker typically starts in those spots at this point. He typically plays around 30 minutes or so. At 4,500, he wouldn't become a must play by any means, but he's someone we can add into the mix as a value play if Mike Conley misses this game. Anthony Edwards is looking like a very viable leverage play. He's on my radar. Just kind of depends on how the rest of this slate shapes up. Great matchup for Cat. Solid matchup for Rudy Gobert. Again, Timberwolves, this trio, all very viable. You can add Alexander Walker in the mix if Conley gets ruled out. Jaden McDaniels is popping a good bit at 4K. Not overly excited about him. Let me look at him in the sim model and see what happens. Yeah, I mean, I would prefer a guy like Grant Williams over Jaden McDaniels, so I don't know how much McDaniels I would expect to see tonight, but if he shows up below 20%, that's fine, but I don't really want to go much higher than that. Unless something changes, and maybe I should look a little bit closer at it, but I don't love it off the top of my head. Next up, we have a game I like more than I thought I would. We have the Pelicans going up against the Rockets. For the Pelicans, they are once again pretty healthy. Herb Jones is questionable. That does open up things a little bit for guys like Trey Murphy and Larry Nance if he ends up not playing, but if he does, team's pretty blah for me. One thing, though, is just the game environment and the overall, I'm expecting lack of ownership to this team. Brandon Ingram stood out for me in the sim model, so I'm planning on at least having exposure to him around field weight exposure. CJ McCollum also stood out for me in the sim model today, so I'll be at least around field weight on those guys. Potential leverage plays depending on where ownership ends up falling by the time we get to the pre-lock show. Speaking of, if you're interested in the pre-lock show and if you want to see the execution side of things instead of just theory crafting around what I'm planning on doing later, on the pre-lock show, I show exactly what I'm doing for that slate. And so to get access to that, link is in the description. Promo code is BOB. Also, we have a Discord. We have a ton of tools you can utilize, and we have a lot of other coaches that give a lot of really good advice to players too. So feel free to join DFS Army if you're interested in that. But back to the Pelicans. I like Ingram. I like CJ. I'll be at least around field weight on them. Zion is interesting again, I never love playing these guys, but the Houston's giving up the second most points to versatile bigs like Zion. And I think this could be a decent spot for him. Unfortunately, I don't love taking shots on CJ, Ingram, and Zion if the game's not the highest total on the slate. It is one of the upper tier. It has one of the higher totals on the slate, but it's not even in the top 3. So I didn't really want to force exposure to Ingram, Zion, and CJ, but I'm okay with 2 out of the 3. Giannis drove out. His minutes just haven't been consistent enough for me to get excited about playing him. But for now, it's Ingram and CJ, and I'm just going to move on. For the Rockets, going up against the Pelicans, no real injury news to talk about for them. Fred VanVleet is projecting well, so I expect him to show up a little bit. Jalen Green is popping in the sim model, and I like the overall just spot for him. He's been in good form too, so I'm okay with Jalen Green, but not expecting him to be a core player or anything like that. Just someone I would like to see some exposure to. And then Fred VanVleet needs to show up for me. If he doesn't, I'll have to force a little bit more exposure to him. Şengün, I'm not on today. Matchup is fine against Joe Val. It's pretty average. I know he had a great game against the Lakers, which we hit on, which is nice, but I don't feel the need to go back to him here against the Pelicans. All right, last game on the slate, we have the Suns going up against the Nets. For the Suns, pretty healthy. Grayson Allen's questionable, which doesn't impact too much for me when it comes to this team. Ultimately, we have the age-old question of Devin Booker or Kevin Durant. Kevin Durant's price tag continues to fall. I'm finally getting on board playing Devin Booker. Sim model likes him a good bit. Let's look a little bit closer at these matchups. Yeah, pretty neutral matchup across the board. Brooklyn has been pretty good against versatile forwards this season, 28th in the league in fantasy points allowed. So not a great situation for Kevin Durant, where they've been a little bit more neutral against players like Devin Booker. So I'm prioritizing Devin Booker here. I'm going to make sure I'm at least around field weight on him. He's someone who I'm looking at as a potential leverage play once again, and that will really just depend on ownership for me. Beal is viable at 6,600. We know he can be explosive, but he's not someone I'm prioritizing at this point. Strongly prefer Tim Hardaway Jr., so it's just not even a comparison. Nurkic, not a priority for me either on this slate. Watch out. I mean, the Nets have been hot lately, guys. The Nets have been pretty good, and I don't know what to trust, to be honest. I feel like we've seen 10 different versions of the Nets. But Ben Simmons is currently listed as probable. I believe he hurt his knee a little bit towards the end of that game, but it doesn't look like that's going to really be anything that will stop him. So Ben Simmons playing does make it a little bit easier for me not to feel like I have to play the Nets tonight, but a few of these guys are projecting pretty well. First and foremost, we can start with Bridges at 7,300. Let's look at him in the sim. Yeah, he's not standing out too much in the sim, but he is projecting well. If you just look at the fantasy points per dollar column, you see that darker green. So I would expect him to show up a decent bit at 7,300. Matchup-wise for him, again, Suns are not a team I like to pick on too often. They've just been in pretty good form from a defensive perspective. Suns are giving up the 27th most points to versatile forwards, so not the best matchup for Bridges, but he's been all over the place from a scoring perspective. He scored 55 fantasy points against the Knicks, one of the better teams in the league, and then had a 30-point performance against the Timberwolves. I've been able to admit at this point, Bridges is just someone that's a little bit harder to predict with stats and statistics and matchups. So if he shows up for me, I'm fine with it, but not a guy I'm looking to force exposure to. Cam Johnson and Spencer Dinwiddie are priced pretty well in the 5K range. I'm totally fine with them showing up for me today, but once again, just not focal points for me. So just to do a quick recap, Clippers, Bulls, Hornets, and Cavs are the main teams I'm building around as of right now. But we have a lot of interesting injury news from the Nuggets and Thunder that could really switch the slate. And then the Mavs are all priced cheap and they're missing a lot of studs. So they're like my lineup fillers that have really solid upside. So interesting slate. It could become even more interesting if news breaks the right way. But it's one of those, let's just wait and see. And then when the news comes, we'll make the right adjustments to it. So appreciate everyone. Know it was an early show. Hope y'all are doing all right. I'll see you all on the pre-lock show. And if you can't make that, I'll see you all tomorrow for this show. Peace out. Bye, guys.